Ladies and gentlemen, children live in an undivided world. Magic is real and reality is magic. Enchantment works both ways. You enchant and you are enchanted. Imagination is truth and truth is what you imagine. The world is you and you are the world. You cannot tell the difference. It is not a safe or peaceful place. Later you may look back upon childhood anxieties with smiling nostalgia, but that is a distortion. It was not only fun, it was also profoundly disturbing. Then a moment comes that you realize you are you. The world and you stand apart, but who are you? What does this separation of private and public spheres mean? As you grow up, you learn how to use words to name and tame your fears, and to describe the worlds you live in, the world of the real and the world of imagination. Words become intermediaries and messengers. Names and words do not mean you are safe. They do not mean that you know who you are. Is it possible to know who you are? There comes a time you see the face of reality changing constantly. There is no way to know what is behind that ever-changing surface. Make up your mind, you say, but reality has no mind. You have the mind, you make it up. You want to find out what is hidden in the core of the onion, as Per Gynt did. Like Per Gynt, you despair, for under each layer you find another one. In the process, you think you learn more about appearances than about reality. Even the city or town where you were born or where you live, the place that is definitely as real as can be, even that can change suddenly. A dark mystery is hidden somewhere like a forgotten nightmare. A struggle for power is in the air, desire. Words are no longer trusted beacons, they barely cover the passion and the lunacy. How do you know? Because your fingers tremble. Because a stranger stares at you. Because someone you have known all your life asks you to say mouth with your mouth. There are different ways of confronting the threatening secret. You let yourself be invaded by fears, you let yourself be gripped by the demon, or you look it in the eye and challenge it. Siri Hustvedt's heroines, Iris Vegan in The Blindfold and Lily Dahl in The Enchantment of Lily Dahl, each are illustrations of these two approaches. Iris is a young student living in New York. In 4 more or less separate episodes, we see how she is confronted with ambivalence, with madness, with love and desire in other people and in herself. In the end, the reader nor Iris are offered a solution, hope, a happy ending, but she has learned a lot. Not in that dreary therapeutic way that tells you to enjoy life with an alcoholic brute because you learned so much from it, because it gives you the opportunity to grow as a person. No, those 4 crucial episodes reveal basic ambiguities. For example, is true love true? Is your identity fixed? Is truth something you can learn? Can we distinguish between good and evil as separate entities? The young and beautiful Lily Dahl lives in Webster, Minnesota. She is a waitress and a student and takes part in an amateur performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream. She wants to be an actress because she thinks acting brings you closer to the essence of reality. She falls in love with a visiting artist, befriends an old woman, and discovers strange secrets of people she has known all her life. Lily Dahl makes choices. She is brave. She does not judge. She is loyal. She has compassion. Two different women, Iris and Lily, intriguing and captivating, intelligent and unpredictable. In both novels by Siri Hustvedt, magic and reality, enchantment and knowledge are inextricably interwoven. Siri Hustvedt is, her name is an example of that, of Norwegian stock. Her parental home stands in the plains of Minnesota. She has studied English literature at Columbia University. Her PhD treated language and identity in Charles Dickens. She lives in New York, and Anne said already she is married to the author Paul Auster. She has a stepson and a lovely daughter, Sophie. She will speak about enchantment, and after the break, as Anne said, we will have a conversation. Her novels are published in a Dutch translation by Helene ten Holt for Antos Publishing Company. Siri Hustvedt.
I guess I'm even taller than Nelika. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. That's the kind of introduction that makes you want to weep with happiness. That was wonderful.
You want the microphone higher?
As long as you can hear me. Can you hear me? No. All right. Great. Okay. I'm going to circle around this idea that was just introduced, the idea of enchantment. This is not really an argument. It's more of an essay in the old sense, trying around the idea of enchantment. And I'm going to read, not chronologically, but a few passages from the novel in between, supposedly illustrative passages, we'll see. All enchantments mean change and doubleness. Sometimes there's metamorphosis, sometimes only an addition of magic to what is. The frog prince is both a frog and a prince who waits for the kiss that will remove the spell. The beauty sleeps for 100 years. The enchantment visited upon her is postponement, not complete metamorphosis. The state of her existence changes as the world grows up around her, shutting her in, closing her down, until an eager young man, sword in hand, enters the tower. She is herself and not herself, like a person in a coma. I am here to say that enchantment is real, that there are spells cast and undone, that we, all of us, live in the grip of magic. Novels are not essays, even though there are some that feel like essays. Mostly they're stories, long or short, but they have ideas, nevertheless. And if there is an idea in the Enchantment of Lily Dahl, it is surely this: there is magic in the ordinary world, and it is a magic of change and movement and two-ness. To think well, one must always go back to the beginning, to first questions, to the questions of children and philosophers. Why do we see what we see? And what are we? We all begin somewhere, and that beginning is before memory. We begin inside a woman. How strange. I mean, when you think about this, it is very strange and completely incontrovertible. Anyone who's been pregnant feels awe at her plurality for that time when you're two people in one. The liquid reality of the womb is lost to our conscious memory, but it returns to us. I really believe this again and again. When we curl up to sleep, when we rock ourselves, when some of us swim, those of us who like water, and when we enter each other sexually. This very first world comes before language, before symbols, before difference. Once we have left it, it can only be recovered in fragments, never whole. But I am convinced that all enchantment is rooted in this early experience of non-difference, which becomes, after a while, the motion between one person and another. Anybody who has children knows it takes years to enter what we call the real world. Before the age of 5, the world is still magic and unstable. Monsters lurk on the stairs. Imaginary children sit at the dinner table. Elephants arrive through the window and destroy toys. The lie is not yet a lie, and the truth is not yet truth. The names for objects come quickly to children, but pronouns come slowly. I think this is a very interesting point that people who have children always notice. I and you appear late because though I and you is the axis of discourse, as this wonderful linguist Emile Benveniste says. In other words, they move back and forth. I can become you at any moment. It just depends on who's speaking. Aphasiacs lose pronouns first, according to Roman Jakobson. They're the first to go, you know? Things start going wrong with your brain, and the pronouns disappear most quickly. I met an analyst once who told me that she had been to the hairdresser right before a session with a schizophrenic patient. And she walked into the room, he looked up at her and he said, "You cut my hair." Sometimes even the names for nouns leave us. We forget them. They seem to dislodge themselves from what we are looking at. I gave this experience to Lily Dahl rather early in this novel. She gets her menstrual period, runs upstairs, and sits on the toilet. This is a very brief passage. Sitting on the toilet in her apartment, Lily felt grateful to be off her feet. Her jeans and underpants were lying on the floor, and she was looking down at the blood stain on the white material of her underpants. In red, it's red brilliant against the denim and the dull blue floor tiles. She didn't want to move, but after several seconds she reached for her tampons, unwrapped one and pushed it inside her. She glanced down at the blue string between her legs, at her bare knees and the lines of their bones, and had one of those sudden, curious feelings, more sensation than thought, and more familiar to children than adults, that she wasn't really there in the room at all, that she had been blown out of her head somewhere else, and that everything she was looking at was no longer itself, but a kind of inanimate imposter. Lily changed position to get rid of the feeling, and then changed into a fresh pair of underpants and jeans. Such experiences are ordinary, but at the same time they're very odd. I think the connection, of course, between the ordinary and the terribly odd was made by Freud in his famous essay on the uncanny, as we say in English, or the unheimlich. In other words, that it's the very hominess of the unheimlich that makes it so strange. There's another story about home that my father had when he was a boy. He lived on a farm in Minnesota, and he got lost in the woods. He was about 8 or 9 years old. And he wandered and he wandered and he wandered in the woods, and he finally came out, and he stood and he looked out at this completely unfamiliar landscape. He looked down at a house and he saw a barn, and it took several minutes for him to realize that he was looking down at his own farm, at his own house. This kind of disorientation can happen to all of us. Many people have had experiences of not realizing that they're seeing their own reflection in the mirror. It gives you an idea to what degree we need orientation both in language and in geography in order to recognize things. Some people suffer this kind of alienation so often that their existences become a torment, and they feel that they don't inhabit themselves. In other words, to live firmly inside oneself is not a given, nor is it a given that things firmly occupy themselves in language. One of my favorite passages is from Samuel Beckett's What, and it's a wonderful exposition of exactly this feeling of loss between the word and thing, and here it is. For What now found himself in the midst of things which, if they consented to be named, did so with reluctance, looking at a pot, for example, or thinking of a pot at one of Mr. Knott's pots. It was in vain that Watt said, pot, pot. Well, perhaps not quite in vain, but very nearly, for it was not a pot. The more he looked, the more he reflected, the more he felt sure of that it was not a pot at all. It resembled a pot, it was almost a pot, but it was not a pot of which one could say, pot, pot, and be comforted. Although language is a central experience of being human, it is dependent on early life for it to flourish. We all know about this, the cases of wild children, of Caspar Hauser, of the wild child of Aveyron. Children who have been locked away do not learn language, or if they learn it only in an impaired way. Their access to language is severely limited. The ability to have and learn language may be universal, as Noam Chomsky argues, but natural though it must be, you have to live in it early. I have a character in this book who's obsessed with the alienating properties of language, its abstractness, its distance from things. Martin Peterson leaves Lily a note in a cafe where she works that Nellika mentioned. On it is written the word mouth. Now, when I wrote this part of the book, I have to tell you, I had no idea why I wrote it. It had to be mouth. It just came to me. And I had no idea how Martin was going to explain this. Not in the least. And when I got to that part, Martin just started talking, and what he says to Lily is that I wanted your mouth to say the word mouth. And I like this very much because, it's one of the only words that works. You understand, right? The thing and the word touch. Mouth. It works. It's good. I thought it was good. It is very good, mad thinking, but in terms of that kind of mad logic, it's wonderful. You see, we all have schizophrenic edges to us. At least I do. Because the word and the thing come into contact, mouth is a magic word for Martin. And of course, the more I think about it, again, you think about these things afterwards, is that love begins in the mouth. I don't mean the first kiss, but the infant who sucks milk from its mother, a connection of need and absolute dependence that later becomes love. Babies get everything they can fit into their mouths. I mean, everyone knows this, right? Again, if you have children, that's how you discover the world. You stick everything you can find into your mouth. That's part of discovering the world. It's a kind of physical bottom line, like pregnancy and birth, the mouth. It's very central. Quite consciously, I organized the Enchantment of Lily Dahl around another physical bottom line, the menstrual cycle. For it too is one of life's essential rhythms, a rhythm tied to the waxing and waning of the moon, a physical reality that implies possible others. The man who enters the woman and the child that could be born from that entrance. Blood is at the bottom of things, the inside, a movement of life, which again implies the enchantment that most of us know, falling in love. Let us be frank, we cannot explain this phenomenon. I mean, this is It's obvious, but it's important that everybody acknowledge this. I really think it's important because people forget. It's the ultimate human nonsense. I saw you, I fell in love, I couldn't eat or sleep, my heart pounded, my breath was short, I forgot what I was supposed to remember, and I remembered only you. You are everything, and all I want to do is make love to you over and over again. I am drunk with love, crazy with it, hurt with it, afraid of it. Love is unreasonable, and like all magic, it takes us back to our first great, passionate experience that precedes memory. And this heavenly nonsense is the subject of Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream, the play inside the text of Lily Dahl, a play which also has a play inside it. As you just keep going in. Dream is about this nonsense of love. There are two couples, and this is a very famous play, but even famous plays you forget, unless you keep going back to them. Hermia and Lysander, and Helena and Demetrius. Hermia's father wants her to marry Demetrius, but she wants Lysander. Early in the play, Theseus points out that Demetrius is just as good as Lysander. In terms of the play, this is absolutely correct. The two young men in that play are absolutely interchangeable. You cannot tell the difference. They are as alike as two red apples. There's no character difference. They display no differing characteristics. They are just about exactly the same. The difference between them is not in fact, but in Hermia's eyes, which she articulates early in the play. She says, "I would but my father looked with my eyes." That's the heart of the matter. And a lot will happen, mix-ups and magic flower juice and all sorts of craziness before Hermia's father comes around. There are two worlds in the play, the world of daylight, law, and logic, which is Athens, and the world of the woods and night, sleep, and fairies. The two worlds entwine. The lovers enter the fairy wood, and by the light of the moon, the magical beings rearrange the couples and put the right girl with the right boy. Before the order of things is repaired, the lovers sleep. They fall into unconsciousness, and waking, they find the world has changed, but cannot shake off slumber. Demetrius says, "Are you sure that we are awake? It seems to me that yet we sleep, we dream." Isn't this borderland between sleep and wakefulness a threshold we all know? Am I awake or am I still dreaming? Where is the line between these two states? A midsummer night's dream inhabits this borderland, and so does Lily Dahl. In my dreams, I fly. When I was a child, I soared in the sky high above the ground with speed and daring. But now I fly just a little bit off the ground. But it's still good. And in my dreams, I'm also telekinetic. I can move objects simply by looking at them. This is another, I love to have these dreams, and I really believe them. When I'm dreaming, I'm really moving those objects. Again, I don't think this is at all uncommon, but the pleasure of that power is immense. I am certain of my own magic. Wishes come true. Like everyone, my girl Lily dreams. She dreams a dream I actually had. This is when fiction gets very complicated. When you put a dream that you dreamt into a book, and you realize after you had the dream that the dream is about the book. You see, so it's a very circular thing. The dream that I had seemed to answer the book's ultimate mystery. In the book, Lily Dahl, rumors are speeding through the town of Webster, as rumors always do. There have been sightings of a man carrying the body of a girl here and there. A woman has seen the ghost of Jesse James with a woman's body. An old man, one of the twin brothers who never wash and make their money dealing junk, Dick Bodler, tells Lily he has seen Martin Peterson carrying her through a field. But Lily was not there on the night in question, wasn't even near there. Then Martin Peterson tells Lily himself that he was carrying her through a field. In fact, he insists on it, and the night after Martin has spoken to Lily, she dreams. This is the dream that I had. Noises from the street, Mabel's typing, and half-conscious thoughts accompanied her first 2 hours in bed when she was neither really awake nor really asleep. Moonlight shone too brightly on her eyelids through her thin curtains, and Lilliputian voices chattered lines from the play. Her pillow was too hot. She fluffed and patted and turned it over again and again. Just before she felt herself finally dropping into sleep, she heard Howie Bickle's voice in her head. Howie was starveling in the play and moonshine in the play within the play. A slow talker from a farm west of town, he dragged out every vowel. This lantern doth the horned moon present. Then after what seemed to be only minutes of sleep, she heard the alarm ring and sat up in bed. Moonlight was still shining through the window, which didn't make sense. But Lily stood up, walked toward 2 rectangles of light that illumined the floor, and saw a young woman lying there with her eyes closed. Lily bent over to examine her. "So you're here," she said. The woman didn't answer, but Lily didn't expect an answer. She looked down at the body and noticed a long piece of white fabric wrapped tightly around her hips, her shoulders, and breasts. The fabric puzzled Lily. Why was her stomach bare? Lily looked at the girl's navel with interest, and while she looked, a word suddenly came to her that solved the problem of the young woman. Bell clothes. The word elated her. "I know," she said to herself. "I know." But then as quickly as it had come, the feeling left her, and she thought, "She can't be here. I've got to get her out." Lily bent down to lift the young woman off the floor, but the body that looked as soft and white as dough wouldn't budge. And after tugging hard, she discovered that the young woman's hands had been attached to the floor with screws. Lily panicked, and in her panic she began to suspect she was dreaming and tried to fight her way out of the dream and away from the moonlight shining on those bloodless palms screwed to the floor. But telling herself to wake up had no immediate effect. She was drowning in the dream and struggled towards its surface, flailing and kicking her way up and out as she told herself to wake up. With her hands above her head, she pressed against something soft and wet, bursting through it to find herself awake and lying on her bed. The moonlight had disappeared. Nobody was on the floor. Had the nightmare taken place outside her room, Lily might have found comfort in waking to those 4 walls, but the distance between dreaming and waking had been too close. She sat up in bed and tried to recover the word in the dream that had made her so happy. She felt herself reaching back for it, finding it not in her head, but in her mouth. She had said it in the dream. Bell close. "It's nonsense," she said to herself. Mabel wasn't typing anymore, and in the silence of her room, Lily tried to stay awake but couldn't. She slept again, dreamed again, and found the young woman on the floor again. "I'm dreaming," she said to herself. "I have to wake up." And Lily woke up in her room and looked out and saw the moonlight shining down on the young woman's body. And so it went all night. Time after time she told herself to wake up, and she did, But sometimes she woke from a dream inside the dream and found a body again. After a while, the police came into the dream, and Hank with them. They broke through the floor, poked their feet through the ceiling, and crawled in from the window. They pounded at her door in a rhythm as steady and relentless as a drum machine. So, I dreamed that secret word. And the word was bell close. In the dream, it rang with the power of open sesame or abracadabra. I have tried to analyze the dream through the word. The bell is double, like a bell tolling and like the feminine adjective in French, belle, a word which was also used for Southern women in America. The second half of it, close, suggests shutting, ending, and also the word close, nearness. The girl is dead and ended, but she's also very near to Lily, and therefore to me. Bell close also resonates with the word bellicose, or warlike, which hints at a violence implied by the girl's presence on the floor and the subsequent forced entry of the police through the floorboards. The word that solved the mystery of the book is no solution in the light of rational discourse. It is a writer's wish fulfillment dream, the single word that solves everything. But once my dream had jumped inside the book, it changed. It became a premonition of the power of art, which is itself related to dreams. I don't give away plot revelations, nor do I always understand why I write what I write. The story comes, it feels good, and I leave it. It is certain, however, that in the dream, Lily looks down at an unconscious, unknowing double, and that the double reappears in many different forms throughout the novel. Doubling, as Otto Rank has pointed out, is connected to death, but doubling is also mirroring, part of self-consciousness and human identity itself. I would but my father looked with my eyes. This is Hermia's plea for paternal love to triumph over paternal law and sanction, but it's also a plea for the imagination. Because I love you, I imagine I am you. I have put myself in your place and understand that you want only Lysander and no one else. All love is this motion into otherness. We do not only fix on an object, we imagine ourselves as the object of the beloved. We imagine that we are the other person looking back. Love is always double because it thrives in the zone between I and you, a zone that slides from one person to the other. The enchantment of love, then, is dependent on the imagination, on the ability to imaginatively become the other through a form of mirroring and to throw ourselves into the strange drama of the between. Martin Buber is the person who has discussed this terrain best, as far as I'm concerned, especially in Between Man and Man. He talks about the between as a separate philosophical category, which I think is absolutely the truth. In other words, this space is something in itself. There's no magic without the between. But what goes on there? Lily Dahl spies on a man who lives across the street from her. She watches him in secret through her window and sees him in his window, painting canvases which she can't see. Between Lily and the man, Edward Shapiro, lies Division Street. This is actually a real street, and isn't it a wonderful name? It is the street in my hometown. This is a hometown that has the most wonderful philosophical names. We have Division Street and we have the Ideal Cafe. He doesn't know that she is there, and they have never spoken, but she has already filled the space between them with wishes and dreams, the fullness of her erotic longing. Love is largely unconscious, a replay of early love, but at the same time its course is determined by the deepest levels of cultural fiction, part of our language of the world, of playing the game of eros, of turning the other into an object and turning oneself into a desirable object for the other. The entire Western history of love conceits and metaphors may be dredged up to serve us. From Greek love of the beautiful boy athlete, to the pining troubadours, to English sonnets, and on and on. But you really don't have to go back very far. Lily likes Marilyn Monroe. So do I. She is a person who is, of course, not a person anymore. Not only is she dead, but she has become a thing, generated and reproduced over and over in photographs and on objects, an image which can now be reduced to only a few lines, a sweep of hair, arched brows, lowered lids, and full, almost always parted lips, like Elvis with his cowlick. These two iconic beings appear and reappear in the Enchantment of Lily Dahl. Female and male principles in our culture. They had to be in the book, had to haunt it, so to speak. But it wasn't until I had finished writing the book that I was walking down the street in Brooklyn and I realized what they were. They are like Oberon and Titania, the king and queen of the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream. In other words, there's a lot of mirroring in this book, and I realized that I just had to hold on to those two because they polish off that mirror. So, Lily decides to get the painter's attention, and she strips for him in the window. I'm going to read you the strip passage. I have to tell you that she's stolen this pair of shoes that I'll inform you a little bit about lately, so you just have to take it for granted about the shoes. When she stood up, the shoes hurt. I'm bad, she thought. And at that same moment, she knew what she was going to do. Lily turned on every light in her apartment and yanked open the window so violently that she saw Shapiro turn his head and look toward her. Good, she thought. Good. He walked toward his window and leaned out. Mabel was typing urgently next door. Lily heard the woman pause, then beat the keys again. Lily walked straight to the window and faced Shapiro. She reached for the band that held her ponytail, undid it, and shook her hair onto her back. She looked straight at him, although his face was hidden in shadow, and unbuttoned her blouse slowly. Then she threw it on the floor, ran her fingers over her naked shoulder, and bit her bottom lip hard, rolling the flesh inward. This is wonderful, she said to herself, and unbuttoned her cut-off jeans. She turned to one side and wriggled out of the tight shorts. She could feel the stiff material slide down her buttocks, and that sensation, along with the fact that she knew he was looking at her, prompted an image of herself as someone else, a party girl, crashing a strip show, a girl who would never say die and who could bump and grind with the best of them. She had to hold on to her underpants to keep them from gliding down with the shorts, and she did this as gracefully as she possibly could. Then she hurled the cutoffs in the direction of her blouse, tossed her head, and smiled. She hoped he could see the smile. All she could make out of Shapiro now was his silhouette, the line of his head and shoulders in the window. Lily unhooked her bra. She was glad she had worn the one with the front clasp, so she didn't have to struggle with the back. She let it fall down her arms, and then crossed her hands over her breasts and rolled her shoulders. These were borrowed gestures, but that was part of the pleasure. For an instant, she thought about Marilyn, took the bra in one hand and flung it across the room. The bra sailed higher and farther than she had intended. On its way down, it caught the TV's on-off button, and there it remained, hanging several inches off the floor. Lily stared at the bra. It was gray. I've got to go to the laundromat, she thought, and looked down at her breasts, then at her feet. Red marks had formed where the laces rubbed into her skin. She felt naked. For an instant, she considered making a dash for the bed and rolling herself in the blanket, but instead she covered her breasts again. Oh my God, she thought. Her heart was beating fast now, and she took a long breath before she took off her underpants. You can't stop now. It would look really dumb, like you lost your nerve. But the sight of her pubic hair sobered her even more, a triangle of dark hair, more poignant than erotic. Lily didn't touch the shoes, even though they were pinching her toes like vices. Standing at her window, wearing nothing but the shoes, Lily looked across the street at Edward Shapiro. He left the window. For a moment she stared at the back of his canvas, at the chair and the black telephone, and almost cried. But she held back the tears, walked to the window, and after wrapping herself in the curtain, sat down on the sill. She could smell lilacs in the air. The scent probably came from the bushes outside the library at the end of the block. Their last days, she thought. And that was when Lily heard the music. A man started singing in a language Lily didn't know, and after a short time a woman answered him. Edward Shapiro came back to the window, and Lily looked at him and listened to the man and woman singing together. She leaned back against the window frame. The crackled paint scraped against her shoulder bone, and she adjusted the curtain to protect her skin. It was a duet from an opera. That much she knew, but it was much simpler than she had imagined that kind of music could be. She thought it was the prettiest song she had ever heard, and she wanted it to go on and on because she knew it was his way of talking to her without talking to her. And she didn't feel like crying anymore. Listening to the voices of those two people, she imagined that the real adventure of her life was beginning now. That after this, anything could happen, anything at all. When the song ended, the man left the window to turn off the record and returned for a second time. Lily looked into his dark face. They could have called to each other or waved, but they didn't. They continued to look at each other for what seemed like a long time, but maybe it wasn't. Lily heard the sound of a car up the street, the wind in the tree branches at the end of the block, and then running footsteps in the alley behind the Stewart Hotel. She looked toward the sound, but saw nobody, and then the footsteps stopped. She realized that Mabel wasn't typing anymore either. Lily took a last look at Edward Shapiro, and then she stood on tiptoe in the painful shoes and slowly closed the curtains. The shoes Lily is wearing are not her own. She's taken them from the bottler's garage, the two dirty guys who deal junk, stolen them. She believes that they belong to the old men's mother who was buried alive by her husband years and years ago. Like most incredibly gothic stories, this is taken from a true story in my hometown. They found the corpse of this woman, years later, and the position of the corpse made it clear that she had been buried alive. So, people are always talking about the unlikely stories in fiction, but in fact, right from the world. I use the story for my own purposes because I've always liked magic shoes. In Cinderella, in The Dancing Princesses, and of course in Snow White, those burning red-hot shoes that the wicked queen must dance in until she dies. These are the shoes of otherness. Put yourself in his shoes, we say in English, and then see what you would do. It does not matter whether the shoes Lily wears really belong to poor Helen Bodler or not. It is a fiction she needs. The story helps to create the striptease show she performs for Edward Shapiro and she knows it, but she doesn't know why. Striptease is a convention, pure and simple, a cliché, a style of titillation. Less elevated than the sonnet, admittedly, it does the same thing. It focuses on one part of the female anatomy at a time. And it articulates an erotic convention. As long as this cultural enchantment is uninterrupted, Lily feels like a sex kitten. It is the gray color of her bra that disenchants, and the whole mundane world comes roaring back with the laundromat. She's naked, for as we all know, nakedness is not the same as nudity. The nude, the odalisque, the stripper are clothed in the vapors of our cultural ideas, ideas that live in the very language we speak, in the words we utter. But here's the rub, so is nakedness. In other words, nakedness might feel different from nudity. The laundromat might seem less elevated from that enchantment that Lily feels in the window. But the question is it any more real? The mundane is also something determined by cultural fictions. The poor schizophrenic Martin Peterson feels the distance between language and things, but can't accept it. He wants to push away the skin of language, of culture, and then go down to the real. He wants to somehow resurrect the world of original newness, but this is impossible. He plays with words as if they were real objects, turning them this way and that, to see if they will take him to a magic door. The pun, a linguistic twin, suggests a secret truth for him. But the pun points only to the arbitrariness of words. Like rhyme and alliteration, it is merely the music of chance, to quote a writer I love. Words are what writers use to make art, and art of all kinds is a mysterious thing. It rises out of the ordinary and the everyday, out of words and paint and plaster and stone and bits of rubbish, from notes scribbled by a composer on a plain white page. Whatever its material, it is rarely fully conscious, but draws from what we don't know and have little access to. Art lives in that borderland between waking and sleeping, between dreams and rational discourse, and also between I and you. It is by nature dialogical, and it rises up in the between. And art, like dreams, is part of the real material of life. The stories we tell each other, the pictures we make, the music we listen to enters us and becomes part of how we articulate what we see, part of the drama of looking, part of seeing with the eyes of another. Whether the story is Sleeping Beauty or a romance novel, whether the image is a Duccio Madonna or the pop one, the music of Mozart or heavy metal, these forms are the air we breathe. Among the structures we internalize, what is inside and what is outside, where do we begin and where do we end? Am I dreaming or am I awake? Is not my reality all of these things? I am certain that art has changed me, that time and time again it has wrought both beautiful and terrible spells over me. When it is good, the person who looks or reads or listens will never be quite the same. And when you are under that spell, you fall deeply into the space between I and you, because every reader writes the book he or she reads, makes for himself or herself the world of the book as much as the writer did. You lose yourself in the magic of recognition, not the dull recognition of cliché, of worn-out truths or ideological cant, but a mirroring otherness you would never have found without that book, that painting, that music, which has turned you inside out. That is enchantment. and I'm going to leave you with Shakespeare because it's always good to leave you with Shakespeare. This is from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason can ever comprehend. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's the beauty of art, being an observer, being outside, or you think that's an impediment?
Well, the drama of art, as I said, is always that there's some kind of spectator, because, the watcher is sometimes, for example, in the painting, and sometimes it's just us standing and looking into a room. Sometimes the people in the painting acknowledge that you're there. Vermeer is the great example of this, people who look back at you, or people who are completely inaccessible to you. But I think it's part of what I was talking about before, too, that drama of the between,
Mm-hmm. But getting back to those two scenes before, in front of the window, Lily Dahl, why starting with such a very intriguing scene, and why also in the Blindfold? Or didn't you know?
I didn't know until later. In other words, I realized, of course, at a certain point that both of these women start out looking at men through a window. And, one can't help noticing that and saying, well, this is odd. Of course, in the first book, it's more of a passing New York moment. In the second book, this looking is a kind of obsessive theme in the whole book, because the artist paints people and creates, they sit for him, which is, of course, a kind of looking. If you're painting portraits, people sit for you, you look at them, that's a kind of voyeurism in itself. There's a guy outside on the street watching Lily, Lily's watching Ed. It goes on and on. The whole book is about looking. I think that what happens, a huge amount happens in that space between people and in looking. Both erotic things and non-erotic things that are very often unarticulated.
Mm-hmm. Erotic things and non-erotic things, how to distinguish between them?
Well, I think there's a lot of erotic content to relations that is never acknowledged. Using erotic in the very broad term, and then there are, if you want to use it in a more narrow term, then you'd have to say that, if you're not aroused, it's not an erotic experience.
Mm-hmm. I get to a question posed by someone in the public on paper right now, because we're talking about it. And we get this out of our system.
Yeah.
What's the difference between love and lust?
Oh, right. People love these things. I'm always, remember, you didn't go to American high school, but in American high school, everybody was always saying, you're not in love, you're in lust, or you're just infatuated. I always found these distinctions sort of amazingly academic, really kind of academic. Like, what is if you can't eat, you can't sleep, you're thinking about the person all the time, it seems to me that you're in love. I think what people like to talk about, this is good. I do, however, have two models of I devised this when I was in graduate school after I had given up what I would call a mechanical love relation. And this is my model. There are two models for love affairs. One is the organic and one is the mechanical. And the mechanical is just what you think it is. It's like a machine. You repeat the same erotic drama over and over and over again. Surely this rings a few bells in the audience. You do it till you do it until the machine simply cannot manage anymore, and it grinds to a halt. I think this is, really part of the machinery of Eros too. It's not that it's not erotic; it's a truly erotic model. It's just that it's generally rather short-lived, unless people are deeply masochistic, and everyone knows people like that too. They keep getting the same machine model every time. And then there's the organic model, which is exactly what you think. In other words, the organic model of love has within it a capacity to sprout another branch should you need one, which you always do. So I think those are the two, and I really believe this. I mean, I'm not just, it is comic because we all recognize it, but I really think that long-lasting love relations have to be able to sprout new branches in order to
And does love
sustain.
Include lust?
Oh,
But
yes.
never include lust. Does lust include love or not?
Sure, it can. I think, again, these kind of distinctions are a little bit phony. And part of it is a kind of safety mechanism for people to say, well, you're not in love, if you just want to, hop into bed with that person. I mean, for me, if you really, really, really are violently attracted physically, generally you're in love. I mean, what is the distinction?
Mm-hmm. And there's magic there.
And there's magic. It's real magic. Absolutely.
It's easily broken because sometimes a very small thing can break the spell.
Oh, yeah. That's right. I've actually written about this. The interruption. I mean, I'm going to tell you a story.
You have an example of it.
I have a wonderful example that I knew. A close friend of mine, actually, met a man at a party. And, it was the big thing. It was like really huge attraction. And they ran out of the party. And she took him home, and they got into her room and they both started undressing. And she looked across the room and he was wearing these underwear that she just didn't like. And the whole thing was gone. 1 second. I mean, it's a little like the gray bra. Just nothing left. And she told him to leave. And the thing is that, I love this story because, what do you say? Well, I don't like your boxers, it's over, dear, But I do think that story is interesting in the sense that there is this sort of strange, the broken magic. And another friend of mine said that what she cannot stand is like if she's had a romantic dinner with her husband and they go home and on the way into the house, he adjusts the lids on the garbage cans. For her, that is the end of it. And I think, again, you see, it's this intrusion of what you'd call ordinary life that is breaking whatever your particular fantasy is of love. And I mean, I really do think that this fantasy, this fiction, is very important. I mean, it's not, fake or, oh my goodness, you're just infatuated. The fantasy must remain in place for this to work, for Eros to go.
But why can a small detail break the magic? I know stories like that too. Friend dining out with her loved one, really, and he had all the time while they were talking romantic things, a small little thing out of his nose right there.
Just over.
Finished. And I have something with next. If I don't like the neck of someone.
You remember, to bring this around to literature again, I think no one can forget, the scenes in Madame Bovary when she looks at her husband eat.
Mm-hmm.
That's Flaubert really treats this with a kind of violence. Now, what's interesting is how people survive that. How is that moment either survived or doesn't really happen in that way? I mean, how you can live with someone who doesn't annoy you out of the house, And that's a kind of magic. And my feeling about that is really that one of the things that we have to realize about any other person is that you really can never know, who they are. In fact, every other person is in some way ultimately mysterious.
And so are you.
And so are you to yourself. But the thing is that if you keep that present, that's quite magical and interesting and exciting. And what kills, relations between people is when you think that you know.
When you think that you know, but you don't know.
You don't know. Of course you can't know. It's just impossible to know. It's much too mysterious. But you think you know. Like you can predict, and that's banality. Mm-hmm. And that's also a lie.
Mm-hmm. And it can happen. It happens.
Of course it happens. Absolutely.
Let's go back to Iris and Lily. What does... I wanted to ask you, what does the name Siri, Norwegian, mean?
It's one of these old Sieg names, it's hundreds of years ago they shortened it from Sigrid.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those victory Viking names.
Because it's an anagram of Iris.
It's an anagram of Iris, but I did that. That's right.
So I was wondering, how close are you to your heroines, and Iris and Lily being so different?
Right, well, I'm very close to Iris. I mean, Iris is a, nervous, intellectual graduate student at Columbia. It's very familiar to me. Lily, is is different. I wanted to make someone very different from who I am, and I did, and so she's an inventive being.
Is that so? I mean. Can you completely invent your?
Well, of course she has. She has things. I have things in common with Lily, but I have things in common with the Bodler twins too. I really do. And
what's that? What do you have in common with the Butler twins? You look clean enough to me.
That's right. But there's I started thinking about this, the problem of dirt, which is such a fascinating thing, why we clean ourselves. And let's face it, it's not just for hygienic reasons. It's also to create a kind of order. And there is a kind of pleasure in slovenliness. I'm actually quite a fastidious person. I'm very clean, but I can understand it. I can understand sinking into, just grime. There's something voluptuous about that. Mm-hmm. There really is. And I can get it, even though, I wouldn't do it. But I understand it.
You understand that otherness.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Thing that people think is not normal.
Yeah, I do.
Pathological almost.
Yeah.
When do you cross that border between being normal and being neurotic, psychotic, pathological?
Right. Well, I think about this a lot because I'm actually very interested in madness. I'm very interested in psychoanalysis and the lines between what's mad and normal. People spend a lot of time trying to understand exactly where that line happens, and there are even, personality disorders that are considered to be like diseases of the mind of normal people, like psychopaths, which is, those people can behave, let's put it this way, in a normal way and have what you'd call psychopathic crises. But anyway, as far as I'm concerned, I think, the line for a lot of us is not absolutely defined. And I remember as a child, who's the composer who went mad? Was it Yeah, but he heard voices and
what composers do.
Yes. Was it Schumann?
Beethoven went deaf.
Yes, I know about Beethoven. Well, anyway, I remember sitting in a music class, like in the 5th grade, And the music teacher started telling us about one of those guys who went mad and heard, whistling in his ears and things like that. And I remember I just had this terrible fear that I was going mad, because I've had all kinds of things. I have migraines, so I've had hallucinations, and I've had whistling in my ears and auditory hallucinations, hearing people talk, usually people I know. And my father, who's really a perfectly sane man, hears his father calling him from time to time. It's, something in the brain, some kind of imprint. So I've had a lot of experiences that I would call borderline experiences. Most of them are probably just neurologically produced. But I think it makes you feel closer to, say, people who really suffer from schizophrenia or from schizophrenic episodes.
And those are people that cannot travel back and forth between normalcy and
well, when you have an hallucination, madness. You don't go there on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just, you just, it's just...
people can force themselves back.
Yeah.
Or not.
There are... Listen, there are, I think, forms of mental illness where people need to... For example, there are lots of stories when you read case studies about people who have had some kind of trauma, or even children, and that they just go to sleep for days. It's a very strange thing. I keep encountering this in case studies of people. They just go to sleep.
But when you go to sleep, you dream.
Yeah, but it's a way of, they shut themselves down. It's a way of protection. It happens quite a bit with children. They'll just, something happens, and they go to sleep. It's often after a trauma, after they know that the danger, and grown-ups too, absolutely, they just sleep. I think we all kind of live on this borderland, but I think some of us, of course, maybe inhabit it more fully than others.
You were afraid as a child to cross that border, to get mad, but are you still afraid?
I actually feel I really do. I think what happens with age is that you get a perspective on these experiences, and I think I had a very how shall I put it, a very secure and grounded childhood, and without that, I'm sure who knows, I could be in a hospital, but because of that, I think I feel pretty normal.
Yeah, I wasn't doubting that. I wasn't doubting that. About your childhood, it was in Minnesota.
Yeah,
and you are very much attached to that country, to the plains of Minnesota, and also to Norway. How can you? Yeah, how does your Norwegian childhood, your youth, the years you spent in Norway, influence your work?
Well, everything influences your work. So I think the fact is I actually spoke Norwegian before I spoke English, and sometimes I think that this really did have an influence on the cadence of my English prose. I think that's clear, and I also think that because I grew up in the Lutheran Church, something familiar to Dutch Protestants, that there's a certain resistance in me to, how shall I put it, the Baroque flourish. It's suspicious. No Rococo stuff here, because that really went inside me. The whole Protestant ethic, way of thinking, alarm at decorative, too much decoration. So I think this stuff is pretty deeply inside me.
And the distinction between country and town, city and country life. You love New York. You lived there for about 17 years. You told me you have a love affair with New York, but you also have a love affair with the country.
Right.
Is that an ambiguity that you can live with?
Well, the funny thing is, I couldn't stay in that small town where I grew up. It was absolutely impossible for me. But when I wrote this book, I realized after I finished it, the second book, that my feelings for that town were much more tender than I had even suspected. And in fact, in this second novel, there really is no evil in the book, which surprises me. Terrible things happen, but it's not evil. Whereas in the first book, there really is evil. And that happens in New York. So there's some sort of classic dichotomy between the urban world and the world of a small town that I hadn't imagined I would come up with, and I did.
Is that a romantic vision?
Really, yeah, it's totally romantic, and I'm completely against this idea. I can't tell you. It must be, again, that I have very tender feelings for my own childhood.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine that, but do you feel the same about other small towns in the United States?
Listen, I couldn't stand that town, in lots of ways. I have to say, I just couldn't stand it. It was really provincial, and there's this kind of, I don't know what it's like in Holland, but it's certainly true of Norway, and it's certainly true of the Midwest, that there's a kind of egalitarianism that's very nice, and it's also really brutal. In other words, what people want is that everybody should be the same. And by God, and it's like people are very willing to take care of the downtrodden, the crazy people. That was all fine. It was the other people, the really smart ones, or the really gifted ones. This was treated with a kind of cruel desire to knock them down. And this, this goes on, and this was really part of, this is very Norwegian, and because of that, also very deeply part of the Midwest, and the Grange, and egalitarianism, and everybody's supposed to be the same. A lot of limits on individual freedom, which of course is not true in New York, where it's every man for himself. Yeah.
What did you find in New York when you got there?
I think, a kind of...
was it what you imagined when you were a child?
I think my first... I'd never been to New York before I moved there, except to visit.
Why did you want to go there?
Just by the idea of New York. That was it. I didn't know anything about it. Nothing. I had looked at Columbia University. I knew nothing about New York, but it was New York. So I figured that's where I should live. Mm-hmm. Really, it was that, I happened to like it once I got there. But it was big. It was a big, big city. It was where you were supposed to go, to have adventures. Mm-hmm. It was really bad.
And that has been the final adventure of your life, because you stayed there for about 17 years.
That's right. 20 years.
20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And your inclination to adventure, to danger, how does it express itself now? In novels?
In my work.
Safely?
Yes, safely.
Is it safe?
I don't think life is safe. Actually, people have asked me this before. It's amazing what comes up in the world, just living it. Without going to look for things. I mean this quite seriously. It's amazing what happens. And so I actually don't feel that I have to be looking for anything particularly dangerous.
So you could have stayed also in Northfield, Minnesota?
No, I couldn't have. No.
You could go back there?
To live?
Mm-hmm.
No. No.
But you go there once in a while?
I go every year to visit, and I really always enjoy it. But about 5 minutes after I've arrived in town, everybody knows that I'm home. That's a little scary, You walk into a cafe and people say, I heard you were in town.
But isn't it much more scary if nobody knows you?
Yes, in a way. But you see, I think when I moved to New York, I wanted that, I wanted to be alone. I wanted to see what it was like. Mm-hmm. I wanted to test myself.
And how did you come out of the test?
Just fine.
Uh-huh.
And a little,
And your neighborhood in Brooklyn right now, isn't that
Yes, it's a very,
small town?
it is. It's a very cozy, middle class, neighborhood. It's not.
So you have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh. Let's talk about life and art. Paris, in the Blindfold, says that love of art and personal preferences come from an emptiness within. What does he mean by that?
Well, I think this is a really awful character, this guy Paris, but I always try to give even my worst characters part of the truth, and he's telling part of the truth there, which is, I think that it's, desire means, in order to live, you have to have desire. You don't have desire unless something's missing. That's what he means.
But if something is missing, you must have an idea of what is missing, of what you want to fill that void with.
I think sometimes, but I think a lot of those conscious ideas about what is missing are usually entirely wrong. No, I think people are driven by, some kind of fundamental lacks that we can't even explain. We can't even name, and we fill them in lots of different ways.
And art is
one of the
a
ways.
very fulfilling form to fill that emptiness.
Yeah.
Better than sports.
Well, for some people, sports are a lot better. And for artists, art is the thing. But people do this in lots of ways.
Those paintings in Lily Dahl that Shapiro is painting, they are very special. He paints people in that town, he makes their portraits, and he makes them tell the story of their lives. And then he paints in small paintings, in the big painting, the particular scenes that he chooses from their lives.
They choose.
They choose.
Right.
But he chooses them too, or not? He makes them tell things.
He makes. They have to talk. That's part of the deal. I mean, this is the art. He sits down. He has the person talk to him for several days, and he paints their portrait. And on the top are narrative boxes, and they get to choose the story from their life that they want to go in the narrative boxes. They choose the story. It can be true. It can be not true. Whatever they want, he puts in the boxes.
Mm-hmm. And we never get to know what's in the boxes of Mabel, the old
Yes,
friend.
we do. At the end,
Yeah?
she it's the story of the child.
Yeah, I was wondering maybe that Mabel was the grandmother of Lily Dahl, but that
Right.
was
No.
fairy.
She's the fairy godmother.
The fairy godmother, not really the grandmother, because
Right.
Mabel has a daughter and has a grandchild, and I thought the ages match maybe, but
Yes, she could be.
That's what
Lily
I'm
could be.
thinking.
She could be her grandchild, but she, gave up the child she had for adoption.
Back to the Blindfold. That is, among other things, about transformation, about identities that become unglued. And in fact, that's the darker side of that particular modern theme of the quest for your identity.
Right.
Do you believe that quest for our identity is typical for our time? And if that is so, why?
Well, I don't know. I actually think an identity is something that's formed in a very fragile way over time. That, what identity is simply a narrative that you carry around with yourself and a few fantasies and ideas, and that there isn't such a thing as a true identity. This thing, how people are looking for their true selves and they're running around, they want to get their own voice. This is a big thing with writers. Finding your voice. I remember this wonderful poet in New York said, I always thought they meant the Village Voice. I'm looking for my voice. And you think, where's the paper? But, I think there's something flawed about that whole idea. I mean, it's kind of stupid to me. But I also think that, of course, people need an identity in order to function and live in the world. And, people who suffer from terrible neurological traumas and suffer from amnesia, for example, truly lose their identity, or severe strokes. I mean, you do not have one left because you need to have memory in order to function. And we edit and make these narratives for ourselves that can function very well. And as I said, this thing about inhabiting yourself is not necessarily a given. And I think people who inhabit themselves well, unfortunately, it's a little fatalistic, but they were often people who were loved pretty well as children, but I think people probably spend a lot of time looking for identities when they feel things are frail or fragile or fragmented or falling apart. And that's why in America particularly it's become a kind of mania. Identity politics. This is what we have in America now. And this is what it is. It's that you locate yourself within a group like, I'm an American Indian lesbian novelist. And that's my identity group.
What does it mean for a society that people should have identities fixed like that?
It's a kind of security. It's a kind of way of denying ambiguity. I mean, who says? I mean, you have to fix on so many to get who you are. Then, but I mean, this goes on all the time, and it's a kind of denial of the imagination. It seems to me. There are the arguments that are going on. That you can only, black people are the only people qualified to write about black people. Or women are the only people who can write about women authentically. I mean, I think we should, getting rid of the idea of the authentic is a very healthy thing for American culture. Just throw it out the window.
Yeah, but what comes in place of the authentic then?
The imagination.
Yes, I can agree, but do people have an imagination that can, that doesn't, I mean, how do I put it? If you let your imagination flow freely, that means that you can stop other people from living. You have to have some rules to live by.
Oh, I'm not advocating anarchy.
Why not?
No, I think order is necessary, but I think, it's understanding the nature of order is important. But, everyone needs, we need to organize ourselves. That's what language does, that's what the world does, that's what these identity people are doing. The problem is that you have to understand that you are using these tools as tools of order in which to see things and ways of living in the world. Constructions, they're constructions. And, what's really wonderful and magical about the world is that motion where you can become another, and you can only do that in the imagination. And this is what this whole movement in, so-called left-wing American politics is doing, is saying, that's not true. My experience is, authentic. And I am expressing it in my little book. And it is the experience of the, Midwestern white girl, this is not going to help anyone. Then we can just throw Anna Karenina right out the window because Tolstoy had the gall to write about a woman, right? So let's just get rid of everything, I think the end of this argument, identity politics, is that there's no imagination.
But do other people have enough imagination to live with all those changing identities and all those
I'm not even, I think it's just, it's a matter of courage. I mean, I actually think that the ultimate artistic act, in a way, is empathy. And that if people have the courage to empathize, this simply cannot hurt the world. I mean, this just does not seem like a bad thing to me.
But that means you don't deny that there are people who are psychopaths, who have no conscience at all.
No, there are people like that.
But no conscience.
There are. Of course there are.
So you have to have rules to tame that.
I'm not. So you, of course. I mean, you must understand. I'm not an anarchist. I love laws. I think laws are really good. I would not want a world without laws and policemen and everything. I really am for it. No, really. I'm really for it. Oh, I am.
How does a novel or a poem or an essay grow inside you? Where does it start? Yeah. With a small thing, with a theme, or just a small detail?
Yeah, usually it's something real. It's usually something that happened. Like the first book really came out of answering this ad on the bulletin board at Columbia for a research assistant, and I met this really peculiar man who lived in the projects. He was so odd. And the conversation we had was so peculiar. And when I left there, I don't know, I felt altered. I felt like I had peeked into this really strange, private, like I'd seen something I shouldn't have seen. And it bothered me for a long time. I would think about this strange encounter. And that's how the first book came about. It was like the uncanny residue of that meeting. And it's not, the book and the story is not the real story, that real encounter, but it's almost like it's closer to the truth of that encounter than the real one was. Because I tried to get at what I felt, what it was, I couldn't figure out. And the second book was really born out of this suicide that happened. The twin brother of someone I knew went into a restaurant, ordered breakfast, ate the breakfast, and blew his brains out. And that brother was someone who followed me around for about 5 years. It sounds like a long time, and it sounds really sinister, but in a way it wasn't so sinister. First of all, I didn't do it all the time. He'd just suddenly appear. He was one of those guys who would shave his head, for no reason. Suddenly his head was shaved. Or you would see him outside, eating out of a tin can. He was young, he was my age, but for about 5 years, I would find him, standing outside my house for no reason, just waiting for me. Or follow me after work. This kind of creepy thing. And I think that story, I started wondering, first of all, who the twin brother was and who the other twin brother was that, of course, killed himself in the restaurant. Why would someone do that? And I think I thought, see, it's one thing to kill yourself in private. It's another thing to kill yourself in front of other people in a restaurant. Now that is suicide as performance. And I think the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, everything grew out of that. I didn't know it, but when I think back on it now, I think that's what it was. It's always something real.
Mm-hmm. I have the public has the opportunity right now to pose a question if someone has a question left.
Kind of killed you here.
Yes? Over there?
Well, I'm sure it's not your favorite topic to talk about, but I'm curious to know anyway, what role does the work your husband play for you in your own work? Because I recognize a lot of the themes that he uses and a lot of the situations he depicts. I only read the
Right. Well, it's funny, I really don't see this. I mean, I think, Paul, I really love Paul's work. And it's possible that it's had influences on me that I'm not even aware of. At the same time, I always think that I'm much more interested in, let me put it this way, the nuances of social intercourse than he is. And if you really opened both the books, you would see, for example, how different the style is. How, it's both of our prose is very lucid, it's very clear, but it's written in a very different way. In other words, I have this kind of incantatory rhythm, and Paul has a tendency to structure his books like stones, really like a collection of stones. And if you were to read a paragraph to you, you would hear instantly how distinct it is, and I think how unlike my own work. And the funny thing is that people said this about the Blindfold, because I think it was set in New York. And interestingly, it was just like, it's New York, but I can't think of, what does Iris do that is like any of Paul's characters?
Well, for example, what you said, this was not Iris, but what you said about observing, how Lily observes.
Right.
This man Shapiro.
Right.
And I think it's in one of the stories.
In Ghosts. I know, but in Paul's, this is a completely abstract kind of, it's not erotic voyeurism. It has nothing to do. He's looking at a man through a window, but it's really, this is the drama of making novels, of writing. It's a completely, how shall I put it, it's blue and white and black. I mean, we are in a different land here from this little girl in Minnesota who's really getting erotically excited by watching a man, admittedly, paint, but it's a pretty different world. You know what I mean? I mean, there's the Charterhouse of Parma, too, which, has a voyeurism. The whole book is voyeurism.
And you're not married to Stendhal.
I'm not married to Stendhal, exactly. I just think that people are, always grasping for these parallels, and I think, they may be there, but I think they're not in things like that, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Somebody else out there, if I can see the fingers. No?
There.
Yeah?
Right in the leg.
Sorry, I can see. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could give an example of maybe an activity that you do or a moment that you have where you're not self-aware.
You think I'm so amazingly self-conscious or something? Or what do you mean? What do you mean? You mean that I'm not thinking about what I'm doing while I'm doing it?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? But I mean, I'm up here sort of analyzing things. That was my job today. I mean, I garden, I sing songs, I play with my daughter. I read, and you think about what you're reading, but you're not analyzing what you're reading while you're reading it.
Why did you pose that question? If I may ask. What made you think of it? Because that's interesting.
A number of things. Because the theme of voyeurism, which we've been talking about.
Oh, right.
You do seem hyper-aware. Also that Shapiro was supposed to be created that you were going to be having an intimate conversation under the guise that there was no audience.
Well,
No,
that's what I
no,
said.
she
That's
said
what
that.
I said.
I really can't forget that you guys are here. If you think I can, then you've got another thing coming. I mean, that's impossible. Right. No, that was not me, actually.
No, it was me.
Right. That was her.
Yeah?
Maybe it's not a real explanation for it, but the painter in your book, why does he let the model pick out the paintings and not, as creator of the painting, picks out the stories
Right.
of the model itself. Is there an explanation for that? Or?
Yeah, well, I think it's, this drama, he wants it to be a collaboration. For him, the idea of a portrait necessitates that the person painted has some investment in the painting. You see?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
But why a story? Why can't the face, the whole personality of a
Right.
person be enough?
I'm sure it's like a novelistic bias.
Mm-hmm.
It's the idea that narrative is a powerful thing, and he wants to have narrative in the paintings.
The last question.
We're all exhausted.
That was the last question.
Exhausted.
Okay, thank you very
Finito.
much.
Thanks.
Serious.